In the twilight of his life, Clint Eastwood, a name synonymous with American cinema, has come forward with a revelation that has stunned both fans and the inner circle of Hollywood. At 94 years old, Eastwood has enjoyed a career spanning over 7 decades filled with iconic roles, legendary directorial achievements, and a mystique that kept his personal life veiled from the public eye. Throughout the years, rumors swirled about Eastwood's complex relationships with women, children, and the idea of family itself, but none held the weight of what he finally chose to confront. In a sit-down interview that felt more like a cathartic confession than a media spectacle, Eastwood opened up about something he had never publicly addressed before: why he had distanced himself from one of his sons, a subject long buried under years of stoic silence and Hollywood distractions. Clint's voice, though gravelly and weathered, carried a quiet strength as he recounted moments from decades ago. He didn't flinch when the interviewer posed the uncomfortable question. There was no theatrical pause or dramatic build-up, only a man nearing the century mark, ready to unload a truth he had carried like a stone in his chest. The name he spoke was not new to fans, Kyle, Scott, or one of his lesser-known children, perhaps, but it wasn't about recognition or fame. It was about the weight of decisions made and the burden of a father's regret. Eastwood spoke of a time when his career was white-hot. The 1970s and 1980s had him bouncing from film sets to award shows, directing, acting, and maintaining the image of the unbreakable cowboy. During this time, his personal relationships took a back seat, not due to a lack of love, but because he had always viewed emotions as vulnerabilities. He admitted that this mindset, which served him so well in playing hard-nosed characters, bled into his parenting. One son, in particular, had always challenged him, not with disobedience or rebellion, but with sensitivity. Where Clint saw the world in black and white, his son saw color, nuance, and asked too many questions about right and wrong, love and absence. "He wasn't like me," Clint admitted quietly, "and for a long time I saw that as a problem." He reflected on an incident that changed everything, a moment that felt small at the time but proved to be the beginning of their separation. His son had written a song, a deeply personal piece inspired by his strained relationship with his father. He had asked Clint to listen, to understand him through music. Clint, in a moment he now describes as callous, dismissed it without a second thought. "I told him I didn't have time for that," he recalled, his eyes clouded with emotion. "That a man needs to work, not wallow in feelings. I didn't know it then, but I broke something in him that day." That song, Clint would later discover, was the only way his son knew how to express what he couldn't say aloud. And Clint, caught in his own armor of masculinity, failed to see the olive branch extended to him. The years that followed saw increasing distance between the two. Phone calls became rare. Letters went unanswered. On birthdays and holidays, Clint chose solitude or the company of acquaintances over the potential awkwardness of reconciliation. "I told myself he was better off without me," Clint admitted. "I lied to myself so I wouldn't have to feel what I had done." Despite his silence, he kept tabs on his son's life from afar. He saw the interviews, the minor roles in independent films, the public mentions of a distant father, and the traces of pain that never fully left his son's face. Clint's other children, some of whom enjoyed more public relationships with him, urged him to reach out to make amends. But pride, that ever-present shadow of Eastwood's identity, always got in the way. "I thought admitting I was wrong would make me weak," he confessed, "but now I see that weakness was never the truth. Cowardice was." His voice cracked at the word, and for a moment the indomitable man who had once faced off with villains on screen seemed smaller, more human than ever before. As he entered his 90s, mortality began knocking louder. The loss of close friends, peers, and even longtime collaborators reminded Clint that time was a thief that spared no one. One sleepless night, surrounded by the trophies and memorabilia of a life lived largely on camera, Clint felt the hollowness of unresolved love. That night, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he had not called in years. It rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. He hung up and stared at the phone for hours, unsure if he even had the right to try again. In the interview, Clint revealed that he eventually wrote a letter. Not a long one, just enough to say, "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I miss you." He mailed it, not knowing if it would be read or even received. Weeks passed without a response. But one day, a small envelope arrived at his Carmel home. Inside was a picture, a childhood photo of Clint and his son fishing, smiling, the sun catching their profiles in golden light. No note, no words, just that photo. Clint wept when he saw it. It was his way of saying he remembered the good, not just the pain. Though a full reconciliation never took place, Clint made peace with knowing that his son had heard him. "It's not about fixing everything," he said. "It's about finally saying what you should have said a long time ago." He paused, looking out toward the distance as though visualizing the years lost, the moments that could have been. "I was too busy being a legend to be a father. That's not something I'm proud of." The public reaction to Clint's confession was mixed. Some praised his vulnerability, his willingness to bear the truth after a lifetime of silence. Others criticized the timing, wondering why it took him nearly a century to say what should have been said decades ago. But Clint didn't seek approval or forgiveness from the world. He had come forward for himself and perhaps for any fathers and sons still caught in the same cycles of silence and pride. For many, Clint Eastwood will always be the steely-eyed cowboy, the gruff cop, the director of cinematic masterpieces, the man who rode silently into ghost towns and stared down villains without blinking, the figure who made Dirty Harry's snarl iconic, the director who brought us raw, emotionally complex films like Million Dollar Baby and Gran Torino. His presence loomed large across decades, defining masculinity in a generation of cinema that revered stoicism over sentiment, grit over grace. Yet behind that commanding on-screen persona was a man who, like all men, grappled with the choices that shaped his private life, particularly the ones he could no longer rewrite. At 94, in the twilight of his journey, Eastwood stood stripped of the myths, not as the Hollywood icon, but simply as a father looking back at the emotional landscape he had once neglected to nurture. When Clint Eastwood finally admitted why he had distanced himself from one of his sons, it wasn't a press stunt or an attention grab. There was no upcoming film to promote, no book deal to support the confession. Instead, it was something far more human, a reckoning, a need to unburden. His soul before time took away the opportunity forever. He sat in his modest Carmel home, surrounded by mementos of a long, illustrious career, awards, posters, vintage photographs, and yet none of them could silence the echoes of words he had left unsaid. He had lived a life of immense productivity and acclaim, but even a legacy built on decades of cinematic brilliance couldn't silence the ache of personal regret. Clint's revelation didn't come easily. He had spent a lifetime cultivating an image, not just for the public, but for himself, a man who was unshakable, rational, and emotionally invulnerable. That kind of armor, once useful in navigating Hollywood and complex personal affairs, had become a prison of sorts. He had grown up in a generation that measured a man's worth by how little he revealed, by how hard he could be, by how many emotions he could suppress. But fatherhood does not bend to the same rules as movie stardom. And slowly, painfully, Clint began to realize that a hardened exterior could not hide the internal fractures formed by years of missed birthdays, unanswered calls, and emotional absence. The son in question was different from him. Clint described him as introspective, artistic, and emotionally attuned, qualities that, ironically, mirror Eastwood's own gifts as a director, though he failed to recognize it in real time. "He wasn't the kind of kid I understood," Clint admitted. "He asked questions about feelings, about connection, about why I wasn't around, and instead of answering, I distanced myself." Rather than attempt to understand his son's emotional intelligence, Eastwood misread it as weakness or a challenge to his authority. He chose avoidance over engagement, silence over conversation. The years rolled by, and with them, the growing chasm between father and son. Publicly, Clint remained a towering figure. Privately, he began to feel the dissonance between the man everyone admired and the father he had failed to be. He watched his son grow into adulthood from the periphery, occasionally catching glimpses through interviews or secondhand stories. There were moments when he considered reaching out, but each time he convinced himself that it was too late, that too much damage had been done, or worse, that his son no longer cared. But the truth, as Eastwood now understands, is that people rarely stop caring. They just grow tired of hoping. When Clint finally sat down to write the letter that would change everything, it wasn't long or poetic. It was plain-spoken and raw, much like the characters he had played for decades. "I'm sorry, I was wrong. I miss you," he wrote. He didn't expect a reply. He didn't even know if his son would read it. But writing it felt like a necessary act of humility, a crack in the fortress of pride he had built around his heart. When the reply came weeks later, not as a letter but as a childhood photograph, Clint broke down for the first time in years. That photograph of father and son smiling beside a fishing lake was a reminder that there had once been love, once been connection, and that perhaps it wasn't entirely lost. That image haunted him in a beautiful way. It reminded him of a life not fully lived in the most important places: the living rooms, the dinner tables, the phone calls late at night. When a child just wants to hear their parents say, "I love you." For a man who had conquered so many worlds, it was this simple photo that brought him to his knees. It spoke louder than any award ever could. And in that moment, Eastwood understood that legacy isn't made only on the big screen. It's forged in the quiet, everyday choices to show up, to say what matters, to be present even when it's hard. Though he never revealed which son he was referring to, perhaps out of respect, or because the story wasn't just about names, his message was universal. There are millions of parents and children out there living in that same emotional purgatory, waiting for someone to make the first move. Clint Eastwood, the embodiment of rugged independence, had finally demonstrated the ultimate act of courage. Not in a standoff or a shootout, but in the vulnerable admission of failure and the humble pursuit of reconciliation. As the world listened, many were moved not by the scandal of the confession, but by its quiet grace. Here was a man who had lived through nearly a century, weathered wars, fame, love, and heartbreak, and still found it in himself to grow. And that growth at 94 became perhaps his most powerful performance, not in front of a camera, but as a father finally owning his truth. In an era where public apologies are often calculated, Clint's words felt unfiltered, if not unfinished. He didn't ask for sympathy. He didn't try to justify his actions. He simply admitted that he had been wrong and that the price of that wrongness was one of life's most irreplaceable bonds. And in doing so, he offered others a mirror, a window, a chance to reflect on their own relationships while there is still time. At 94, Clint Eastwood didn't seek forgiveness from the masses or a dramatic public redemption arc. He didn't need the world to say he was right. What he needed was to make peace with himself. And maybe, if fate allowed, with the son whose heart he had once turned away from. His story serves as a reminder that time, though fleeting, can still offer moments of clarity, grace, and healing if we're brave enough to confront what we've long avoided. And so, in a world obsessed with legacy, box office numbers, and critical acclaim, Clint Eastwood's most enduring role may not be in any film, but in this final chapter of his life. A chapter defined not by lines memorized or awards won, but by a simple truth spoken after a lifetime of silence. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is lay down the character he's been playing and let the world see the man he truly is. And in doing so, Clint Eastwood reminds us all, it is never too late to come home. For decades, Clint Eastwood was the personification of American cinema's most revered archetypes: the loner, the lawman, the flawed hero with a gun in one hand and an unspoken code in the other. His face, chiseled and unreadable, became an icon of restrained masculinity, where emotions were buried deep and vulnerability was something to be overcome rather than expressed. He was the man who never blinked, never cracked, never faltered. But that very image, crafted so expertly on screen, created a kind of armor in his personal life that was hard to remove. The same detachment that helped him play those legendary roles with such authenticity also created distance in his closest relationships. His children, some of whom were born out of complex and unconventional circumstances, grew up in the long shadow of a man whose life was often in motion, physically, emotionally, professionally, and yet time is the great equalizer. No matter how famous or untouchable someone seems, no one escapes the long, slow reflection that aging brings. At 94, Eastwood found himself in a quieter place, not on a set or in a spotlight, but in solitude, with only his memories and the echo of decisions made and moments lost. Fame, at that stage of life, holds little power. Accolades become footnotes. What matters most are the people you loved, the people you may have pushed away, and whether or not there is time to make it right. In that stillness, Eastwood began to understand something that had eluded him during the height of his career, that love is not about being perfect, strong, or always right. It's about presence, acknowledgement, and the ability to admit when you've fallen short. The act of removing the mask, the cowboy, the cop, the stoic patriarch, and standing emotionally naked takes far more courage than riding into a gunfight. In speaking his truth, Eastwood wasn't just addressing one son or one moment in time. He was addressing an entire lifetime's worth of emotional backlog, the kind that builds up quietly when words go unspoken and wounds are left untreated. The weight of regret is unique. It's not sharp like grief or loud like anger. It's quiet and persistent. It settles into the corners of a man's soul and stays there, often unnoticed until silence surrounds him. Clint Eastwood, who had directed entire films exploring themes of redemption, guilt, and the fragility of human connection, was now living out his own final act through those very themes. Only this time there were no scripts, no retakes, no lighting crews to soften the edges. Just him, facing the hardest role of all, himself. In revisiting his past and acknowledging the emotional absences, he didn't just seek to be forgiven, he sought to become whole. That distinction is important. Redemption isn't always about being accepted by others. Sometimes it's about reconciling with the parts of yourself you abandoned along the way. The father he wished he had been. The conversations he didn't have. The emotional presence he withheld out of fear, pride, or ignorance. These weren't just mistakes. They were defining aspects of a life that, for all its success, remained imperfect where it mattered most. The public saw Eastwood as a man who controlled every set, every performance, every outcome. But what he revealed in his later years is that real life cannot be directed. It's messy, it's painful, and it rarely gives you a clean ending. Still, even at 94, Eastwood showed that it is possible to re-enter the story, not as a hero, not as a legend, but simply as a man who is willing to own what he got wrong. And that willingness speaks volumes in a culture that often values polished narratives over messy truths. His honesty gave permission to others, fathers, mothers, children, partners, to revisit their own unfinished chapters, to reach out, to say the things they've buried under decades of silence. Clint Eastwood's story becomes more than a personal confession. It becomes a universal invitation to heal. There is something profoundly human about realizing that even the giants among us carry regrets, that even men who seem larger than life have hearts that can break. The simplicity of his act, admitting fault, expressing longing, and making amends, is something anyone can do, and yet so few have the strength to actually attempt. That Eastwood did it, at such an advanced stage of life, is both rare and inspirational. He may have spent much of his life in front of a camera, but his most powerful moment may have come in the absence of one, in a private letter, a quiet tear, a photograph of a son he once let drift too far. These things don't make headlines the way film premieres do, but in the end, they are what linger. These are the moments that define a man far more than applause ever could. And so the final image we may hold of Clint Eastwood is not of him riding into a dusty sunset or firing one last round as Dirty Harry. It is of a father choosing to face what he once turned away from, a man choosing truth over myth, a man returning finally to the emotional home he had spent his life avoiding. In that quiet return, Clint Eastwood showed us that strength isn't about how tightly you hold on, it's about knowing when to let go. And as he lets go of the myths and embraces the man he truly is, he shows us all that redemption, however delayed, is still possible.